thank you for coming out. We're going to have an intimate conversation tonight. We're very, very fortunate that Marina was traveling through town and could come and have a conversation with us, along with Dario, Susana, Vicente, and our good friend Daniel, who's going to formally introduce everybody, is going to, and Camilo. This is the first of 3 events that we're having having conversations around what, unfortunately, we couldn't think of a better title for, but Occupy type events. We have our good friend Ana Claudia Teixeira from Sao Paulo, who's coming in October 9th, 8th. And then we're doing an event with Michael Gould-Wartofsky, another friend of ours, reflecting on his very nice forthcoming book on Occupy. Anyways, it's one of 3, and I apologize that we're getting started a little bit late. We had some miscommunications up front, but Daniel? Sure. Thank you,
Daniel. Welcome to everyone. Before I introduce the panel, I think Marina wanted to say something about our youngest guest.
Yeah, I just wanted to let people know, this is Camilo. He's been touring around with Dario and I, kind of evolved as the book was evolving. And, you know, partly it's also intentional, having him in this space as far as thinking that children should be a part of these kinds of spaces rather than left aside. It also means women can participate more. But it means he's going to crawl around and maybe make some noise. And so if you don't want him to touch you, just let us know. Because he will pull up on you and try to play with you. He's super social. But otherwise, if you would help, you know, if he tries to run into a wall or stick his finger in an outlet, just grab him, and that's fine. So, yeah, that's all. That's all for the Camilo.
Great. Thank you. All right. So I welcome everybody for being here. You know, obviously many people are flooding Wall Street right now. I hope nobody here feels guilty for not being there. I think we all know that there will be many, many more opportunities to flood Wall Street again in the coming years. So I'll just quickly introduce the panel and then let you know what introduce the format for the discussion this afternoon. Marina Citrin is a writer, lawyer, teacher, organizer, and dreamer. She's the editor of Horizontalism, Voices of Popular Power in Argentina, the author of Everyday Revolutions, Horizontalism and Autonomy in Argentina, and together with Dario, the co-author of They Can't Represent Us, Reinventing Democracy from Greece to Occupy, and Occupying Language, The Secret Rendezvous with History in the Present. Her work has been published in a very long list of publications, and she has a JD in International Women's Human Rights from CUNY Law School and a PhD in Global Sociology from Stony Brook University. Dario Azzolini is a writer, documentary director, and political scientist and lecturer at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, Austria. He splits his time between Berlin and Caracas. His research and writing focus on social and revolutionary militancy, migration and racism, people's power and self-administration, and workers' control, with extensive case studies in Latin America. He served as the associate editor for the International Encyclopedia of Revolution and Protest, definitely not encyclopedia they had at my high school, and was primary editor for Latin America, the Spanish Caribbean, and the New Left in Italy. He also has a number of editorial positions and has published several books, including The Business of War, and his latest documentary, Comuna Under Construction, examines workers' councils in Venezuela. Then Susanna Draper, breaking from order here, teaches Latin American culture and political thought at Princeton. She's written about contemporary Latin America, focusing on the privatization of urban space, prison writing, and social and political movements in 1968. Has participated in Occupy Wall Street, including her contributions to the Making Worlds a Commons Coalition, and has been involved in the Abolitionist La Abolicionista, a publication of critical resistance. And finally, Vicente Rubio has recently defended a doctoral dissertation on politics, ideology, and culture in contemporary Spain at SUNY Stony Brook. His research focuses on the tensions between cultural state structures and the cultural forms and spaces produced from social movements. Also, of course, a participant at Occupy Wall Street, again, mainly through his involvement in Making Worlds. And he has also worked at Left Forum and has had a series of activist commitments. So Penny Lewis was meant to moderate. You can probably tell that I'm not Penny Lewis, if you know her. But I do have an overdue contribution to a project that she's co-editing. So hopefully I am a protege in the making of hers, and in this sense, authorized to be here. So the format is first Marina and then Dario will each speak. They'll discuss their book and other things as well for about 10 minutes each. And then I think Vicente and Susana were going to speak together for about 15 minutes. And then we're going to bring in the audience for questions and discussion and try to get something lively going taking advantage of this intimate space and opportunity. So without further ado,
I'm going to stand, which is both easier and the mic works, and also with Camila, then he won't crawl on me as much, maybe. And we're hoping to have as much of a conversation as possible. We were going to start with a kind of exercise with people interacting, but because we started a little late, maybe we'll jump to it as we go and just be flexible and see how much we can dialogue. So yeah, Dario and I have been touring around the US, starting in the South, with our book, the They Can't Represent Us book. And I think it's important to say, even though you went through the kind of list of this degree and this publications, this book is written as participants in the different movements. So I was a participant in Occupy as well, even before we occupied, and was in New York at the time. And then even when we are relating to people in the movements in Greece and in Spain and in Brazil, it's from the perspective of kind of whether, if we're not in that particular movement, accompaniment, but seeing ourselves in that relationship, which I think is important. But starting out the book, just as a whole, what we argue is that we believe we're in a new historical epoch, so kind of like 1968 or 1848, and something that is, one second. We can't put our hands on the electrical outlets. And that what makes this moment so important, and what we look at is the kind of the global consistency of the movements around the world, and the numbers of people participating. So we're talking about tens of millions of people who are participating in these new movements. The ones we're going to reference more, I think, today will be Greece, Spain, Occupy, perhaps a little bit of Bosnia, a little Turkey, a little Brazil. But it could also be Portugal, Moscow, Slovenia. There's so many different places that have had these kinds of experiences. And the consistency being in first, people organizing without political parties, without traditional trade unions, and then coming together not in the sense of no and rejection, in the sense of traditional protests and protest movements, which I'll talk about in a moment, but just a refusal of crisis, that is economic crisis, political crisis, cultural crisis, moral. When you talk to people, ethical, all over the world, people talk about this crisis, and it's a multiple kind of crisis. We would argue it's a crisis of capitalism, but that's not necessarily how people are articulating it, but that it is this refusal of this crisis. But then in that refusal, people then look to one another and kind of turn their backs then on these same institutions who have been abandoning people, whether in places people have been organizing strikes. Greece had 5 general strikes, and the government still continued with austerity. Massive protests, we know this in New York and around the world with February 15th, protesting against a war and saying no, and the majority of people say it, and the government says we're going to go ahead. So consistent experiences of being ignored by those institutions of power. And so rather than looking to those institutions to solve these multiple crises, looking to one another. And that's where we see all over the world these people coming together in space, in public space, in taking over the huge plazas from Tahrir to Sindagma to Zuccotti to Sol, we could just go on and on and on and on with these wonderful examples, and beginning to experiment with alternative forms of democracy. And Dario is going to speak very specifically on the question of the rejection of representational democracy that we're seeing around the world, and the practice of various kinds of direct democracy. In all of these as well, we talk about movements, but it's important that we don't use the language of protest movement or social movement. We don't actually believe that all of these new movements in society are that they don't fit into the traditional social movement theory, actually. And that we borrow from Raul Zibeci, who's a Uruguayan writer and thinker, who talks about societies in movement. And he was speaking about societies in movement, actually, when he was speaking about movements in Bolivia, and then again in Argentina, and then again in parts of Brazil, and now in talking about the radical environmental movements that
have been spreading throughout the Americas, also talking about these movements. So people coming together without the traditional forms of organization, without the ideological binds, but also not looking to those institutions of power. So social movement theory tells us we have to have a contentious relationship to forms of institutional power. And these movements are actually not looking to those institutions and looking to one another. We quote in the book Gopal from Occupy Farms in Albany, right outside Berkeley in California. And they were using the framework of goals without demands. I think this is a really nice way to think about how people are organizing. So it's not that there aren't goals. I mean, something we were accused of in Occupy and all over the world was, what are your demands? What are your demands? You're trying to put the movements into that box that people are actually intentionally rejecting and trying to create something else. But having very specific goals. Am I okay time-wise? We're good? Okay. So then I'll give a few examples of this idea of goals without demands, because the democracy Dario will talk about, and I think many of us either participated in some of the forms of direct democracy, but it's a little easier to imagine than when we think about goals without demands and not looking to institutions of power to solve some of these crises. So what might that look like? And I think Vicente and Susana will talk a little bit about the Plataforma, the organizing around housing that's been going on in Spain, but we have these movements in the United States, and they've been spreading where people are, first, people who are facing eviction, whether it's losing their house because of the mortgage crisis or being evicted because they can't pay rent. And instead of going to, say, the municipal government or banks and demanding that the person not be evicted, what people are doing is coming together with one another, with their neighbors, and saying, okay, well, how can we help you not be evicted? So the first thing people do is meet in this assembly form, and then they defend one another. They defend the actual houses. So physically defending, meaning, in the United States, this looks like locking arms. In Greece, defense can scale up a little bit, but actually not very high, all things considered. And in Spain, it's also a total nonviolent resistance and defense of people in the homes. And then there might be a relationship and a conversation with a bank and a renegotiation of a mortgage. But the first point is coming together with one another, looking to one another to then meet whatever that need is, that goal, keeping people housed. In Greece, there are numerous examples. One I'll give actually because it now is being borrowed, or parts of it are being borrowed in Detroit, which is a tax was imposed on people's, it's depending on the square footage of your home, or the square meters of your home, but then the tax was imposed on your electric bill. So if you don't pay it, then your electricity is cut off, which also means the ability to heat water. In some places it's heat at all. And there have been different ways of resisting that. People are organizing in neighborhood assemblies throughout, just like in Spain and in Brazil and in Turkey. People move from the big plazas to neighborhoods. And in these spaces, people have organized to either, well, there's a general refusal. So there's about a 40% refusal rate in Athens alone. And then people are doing things like blocking, actually going and, okay. In the places where it's not computerized, okay, that's not going to work. In the areas where the information as to who owes what is not computerized, people have gone into those centers and just destroyed the records, kind of like the Chilean students did with student debt recently. And then in other places, people reconnect electricity if they get to the point where it's shut off. And then in some places also, they've tried to talk to the electricians and the workers who go out to cut off the electricity, and it hasn't been very successful, in part, I'm sure, due to the high rate of unemployment and people just trying to survive. And so since they couldn't succeed in convincing the workers, and they also tried to convince the workers to self-organize and run the electricity themselves, which they weren't there yet, what they do is then people who, it's often elderly who sit and kind of watch the neighborhood in the afternoon. And when the trucks come, they have whistles and different ways of alerting people in the neighborhood that the truck is coming. And then people run out on the street and they chase the electric trucks off the street. So prevent them from doing the cutoffs. In Detroit, and this will probably be my last example for now, and then we'll get to the discussion, or to other presentations. In Detroit, I think people know that now it's 300,000 families are listed to have their water cut off. This started in August. They've already cut off, I think it's 24,000 families, maybe more, they cut off the water in the heat, like August, hot, Detroit. Cutting off people's water, it's a question of survival. And this is the water companies with the municipal government together, because people owed back any amount of money. I think it's if you owe more than $125 or something like that, they cut off your water. And so people have been organizing, and there's a long history of organizing in Detroit, and petitioning, and there's that organizing is still happening, but at the same time, people are now also saying, no, we're not gonna let it happen. So there are different ways of rigging the tanks that neighbors are doing for each other, so you're not the one responsible for your own house, making it so that when the water company comes to shut off your water, there's actually a layer of wood and cement and all kinds of things that make it so it can't be shut off. In those places where it is shut off, people are helping to reconnect it. And then before the book was published, we actually shared a PDF because of relationships, political relationships with people who are in Detroit. We shared the PDF with some people in Detroit who are organizing this summer, and they read about what they were doing in Greece as far as chasing the electric trucks. And now they organize, and when the water trucks come into the neighborhood, people go and chase the water trucks out of town. So it's a kind of nice, it's not exactly contagion, but a nice spreading of and sharing of ways of defending oneself. So those are just a few examples of the kind of the concept of goals without demands. I think Dario is going to speak a little bit more to that, and then speak in much more detail around the question of democracy and representation.
Yeah, hello. Yes, the CV was a little bit old. I'm assistant professor in Linz, and published a few more books, but some of our books are outside for different administrative reasons. You will not be able to pay them in cash inside, so you can look at them and then pay us outside the building. But there is always a solution for everything. And an important lesson he is telling us, if we want to really change the world and social relationships, being irreverent is very important. Going back to the book, in the book, the different chapters we present are like our country movements are Greece, Spain, and Occupy, or Greece, Spain, and the US as like the most recent movements, but we root a lot of the practices back in different Latin American movements from the late 80s on, 90s, etc. So we also have one chapter on Venezuela and one on Argentina. And we have at the beginning a chapter called Grounding the New Globally, where we make up these connections to movements that existed before in Argentina and Venezuela, in Chiapas, the Zapatistas, and the MST in Brazil, etc., that have very similar practices as the new movements have. That does not mean, and I think that's important, that the new movements copied these things or these practices from Latin America, but it shows how global capitalism, neoliberal politics have created very similar needs all over. And we can see needs and also how people feel like. And especially this rejection of representative democracy as not democratic is something that is a very strong common feature between all these Latin American movements and the new movements globally. And we sometimes talk about the second wave of non-representative protests or rejection of representative democracy. And the thing about democracy is the second big chapter in the book. It's on one hand about how can we situate the question of representative democracy, and what are the new practices created by these movements that are in response to this rejection, setting up all different kinds of experiments how democracy can work differently. And it's important also to say that there are differences all over, even if there is this common rejection, but there are differences all over, and it has to be like that, otherwise it wouldn't be democratic. Just to make a short example, I lived for quite a long time, always about half a year, like during almost 10 years, more than 10 years in Venezuela, always like 4 to 8 months a year. And I worked, for example, in different neighborhoods from 2005 on, helping to create local self-administration in the so-called consejos comunales. And it was a very interesting experience in the sense that you could go to a neighborhood really up in the mountains, like in a really poor, very poor neighborhood. It's especially when you can see them on the cover of a film I did, and this is outside. And if you have an assembly there and 25 people assist, the next day 300 will know what they've been talking about. You do the same thing down in this inner city area where people think they're middle class, even if economically they're not much better off than the people on the hill, but obviously they have more access to infrastructure, etc. But their model, how they live, is much more like our model. Like when they close the door, they live inside their apartment, they have small families. It's not like in the barrio, in the poor neighborhood where you have huge families, you live outside, you talk with everyone you walk by, because it's mainly steps. It's not, there's one main road and the rest is steps. So you have to walk by and say hello to everyone every day. You don't just drive by with the car and stop and go up to your apartment. If you have an assembly with 25 people in this neighborhood, the next day 20 will know what they talked about, because they have the same problems as we have. That many people feel alone, so they just go to these assemblies to see other people, but not even because they're really interested or they are following, etc. So obviously, the models of democratic participation have to be different even in these two different neighborhoods in one city. Otherwise, if they're the same, it wouldn't be a democracy. But so the feeling that came up, I think, very strongly, and it's also expressed in a lot of the slogans, like from Spain, Democracia Real, yeah, real democracy now, or they cannot represent us was a slogan all over, shows how the crisis has intensified this feeling, or many times revealed to people that they don't have anything to say and no influence at all in what's happening in their life or with them. If they have a job or not, if they lose it or not, if they can send their kids to school or not, if they can go to university, if politicians do what they've been elected for, etc., etc., etc. And that's a feeling that is, I think, very common and shared from like the 80s in Venezuela to the uprisings in Argentina in the 2000s, from the Zapatistas, and then up to whatever, Spain and Russia and Portugal and the US in Occupy. And it shows, I think, the end of an era, the clear end of the idea that representative democracy or liberal democracy is a space where we can still gain rights. And I think it's important to notice that if we look how even the fathers of the liberal democracy define liberal democracy, and I say fathers because it's very interesting that liberal democracy has only fathers, no mothers. So
theorists of participatory democracy are generally women.
In a lot of cases, women, yes, not all, but yeah. But it's very interesting how the liberal democracy was born without any mother, and but if we look at it, like people like, let me have a look. Is it here? Sorry, I have to look for it. Yes. Schumpeter is obviously one of the fathers of the modern liberal democracy, and he's very clear about how democratic liberal democracy or representative democracy is, much clearer than anything we've been told after Schumpeter. He says, first of all, according to the view we have taken, democracy does not mean and cannot mean that the people actually rule in any obvious sense of the terms people and rule. Democracy means only that the people have the opportunity of accepting or refusing the men who are to rule them by means of free competition among would-be leaders for the vote of the electorate. Democracy is the rule of the politician. The voters outside parliament must respect the division of labor between themselves and the politicians they have elected. They must understand that once they have elected an individual, political action is his business and not theirs. So it's interesting how even if it's defined so clearly, we've been told from school to the media all the time that like liberal democracy is the democracy. I mean, it's not even a question. It's not even called anymore representative or liberal democracy, but it's just democracy, like it's the only democracy that is supposed to exist. We have to say that during a few decades, it was a frame to gain more rights, without any doubt. But we have also to see that these rights that are supposed to be part of liberal democracy are not part of liberal democracy. They were gained in struggles. Liberal democracy lived very well for a lot of time with having people, rich people, like 6 or 8 votes and the poor ones none. Liberal democracy had no problem that women weren't allowed to vote. Liberal democracy had no problem that you could buy and sell humans. So we see that liberal representative democracy is not a democracy that includes these rights, but they have been gained by people in struggles against the liberal democracy or the main thought. And if we look at history, it's very obvious because liberals and Democrats were enemies for hundreds of years. Liberals rejected democracy and Democrats rejected liberalism. When did it come together? Well, when it could be, the democracy was limited to a so-called political sphere. So when it was out of question that economy is not a scenario where there would be any democracy nor the social sphere, but just this supposed representative political sphere. So I think that then from the 80s on, we experienced that that liberal democracy is not anymore the space to gain rights, but the space where they try to reduce your rights and you try to keep some of the rights or you gained in the 100 years before, but it's more and more difficult. And the crisis made it very obvious for everyone that this is not anymore a frame where people can in any way participate in what concerns their lives directly. So that's why all these movements came up. And just to end, I think the very important thing also that she said is about the goals without demands, in a sense that it's not that people don't want the state to do something, but it's the long experience that whatever they want from the state, it doesn't do it anyway. So it's about taking the action first, not setting up the demand, oh, please don't evict my neighbor, and then we wait if they evict them or not, but it's going there and block the eviction. 2 days ago, just as to add something to this wave, women, how you call with children that are that don't have a husband or that are alone with children. Single mothers, yeah, sorry. Single mothers in London that have been foreclosed and evicted from their houses occupied a whole block altogether. In Italy, this is happening in that families and mothers and migrants occupy whole blocks. Happened in Rome and Turin and Naples and in Milan and in other cities. In Sabadell, which is a satellite city of Barcelona, the anti-foreclosure movement got a whole block they had occupied assigned, I think, 2 weeks ago. In one recuperated factory, and that's another phenomena that starts to exist in Europe. In like there are 2 occupied factories in France, 1 in Greece, 2 in Italy, 1 in Turkey. Before that, they existed only in Latin America, but it starts there. And we visited one in Milan in the end of June, and had a talk with a worker that explained very well what it means, these goals without demands, and what's the idea behind it. He said, okay, we want a law that assigns to the workers, once the factories have been abandoned by the bosses, that assigns the workers the factories because they can do something with them. But who are we going to ask for this law? Should we ask the parliament, the party, or the president? I mean, no one will answer. The only thing we can do is we can set up a movement that is so strong that it will force them to give us the factories. And if we discussed it in our assembly and we looked at history, how are laws made up? And we noticed laws, it's not that first there is a law and then people do what the law says. It's that first there is a practice, and then the state always comes up to regulate something that already exists. That has been like that with everything. So if we want this law, what we have to do is take over factories all over, and then someone will come up and legalize it, because the state always wants to legalize and norm and regulate everything. But our thing is, we start now taking over factories so that someday, if enough people do that, there will be a law. So that's the idea, I think, that shows very clearly what is about goals without demands. It's not that people don't want to relate to the state, or they don't care or ignore the state. They've been ignored by the state, so they choose a social practice to force the authorities to do something as a response. Okay, thank you.
So we stay here, but we like talking kind of together. And so to start, we wanted to start by like some of the issues that Marina and Darío are emphasizing in the book, and they can't represent us, and then how also an idea or a way of doing and living politics without focusing on political representation becomes difficult to represent, no? Because people want big events or big actions leading towards an endpoint, no? And so through these years, from the very beginning of Occupy, but the same like in different parts of the world, what we feel is that there is always this dependence on public opinion, like movements are alive or are dead, is Occupy dead, is M15 over, or so we were kind of thinking that we also something learned from the movements, but that we need to keep training ourselves is on how to perceive and figure political change that is not based on the habits of media and spectacle, no? And this is something related to, in a way, what we started to see in Occupy as one of the many cases, but how the idea of the commons as something that we need to build in everyday practices was central to these movements, no? Because the idea was not, so we do something in order to then take over a state. The idea was, no, we need to be able to go from Zuccotti everywhere, to take Zuccotti to the everyday life, no? To connect to the people with whom we live and the neighborhoods. And so when we started organizing around the figure of the commons, the idea was to create conversations and discussions and encounters and think of the commons as something that goes from the idea of history we have, our common histories, or there is a commons, but then also the problems like the debtor, no? And then strike debt emerged as a figure that was very connected to the 99%, no? The idea that we all share debt, life as a form of debt, no? Education, health, and so this also another common, let's say, thread of all the movements are like the centering or displacement of the idea of the organizers, the professional organizers, no? Like to take politics and political change to everybody as something we do, not that we wait for someone to organize us, no? That specifically like in the US, it's very strong, no? How from the 80s on, the whole business around the NGOs, the non-profits, started to kind of constitute a monopoly over politics, no? So with the assemblies, with the meetings, encounters, there's this idea that politics is something that concerns us in a very micro political level, no? So something like also with the idea of commons was to redefine the public, no? Not to just divide politics as the public sphere, the private, but the idea of necessary reconfiguration of what is public, no? and that's something that cannot just be depending on the state. So this, you can go to the Mareas to explain a
Yeah,
bit
exactly.
more.
For example, one example that maybe encapsulates this, how the common is not only just like a third sphere or a third way beyond public and private, is for example the practice of the mareas in Spain. Is like this marea is tide, like in the ocean, and well, there has been like these movements. These mareas are focused around different public services. Like the education is the green tide. Every marea is identified with a color, green tide. With the public health system is the white tide, and so on. The powerful thing about these mareas is that, in a way, they take, when all the austerity measures began, many people realized that, well, they were being dispossessed by, from, well, basic public services. And somehow, spontaneously, so to say, they, the word common emerged as a, well, this is not just like the state in an abstract way, but this is ours, so to say. And then the mareas went beyond like the traditional union organization and so on, because they posed this problem as, well, since, I don't know, like this public school, this hospital, etc. is ours, it belongs to everyone. It's not only like a labor conflict, for example, that concerns only the workers there in that working center. It's also, it affects, of course, the users. Like, for example, in a school, obviously, it's not only about the teachers, but also the students, the families, etc. Also in the hospitals, it's not only about the doctors and nurses, but also about the patients. And then there were like huge actions of like people almost physically embracing these buildings, these institutions. So what is interesting is that, so they are like public state institutions, of course, but then spontaneously they were felt, so to say, as common. So maybe what is very creative in these mareas is that, well, it's a way of maybe conceiving the protest like anti-austerity protest, not in even like in this anti-term, like this defensive term of like we have to defend public services and so on, but actually to redefine the whole relationship and engagement with those public institutions. So in a way, the common can be also a useful framework maybe to define this relationship with what usually is conceived just like as public. This is the state's responsibility, and that's it. Maybe, since also Marina mentioned it, in a way it's also the Mareas functioning is very similar to the PA functioning in many ways. The PA is the platform of people affected by mortgages. And well, it's just, since Marina mentioned it just to, I wanted to highlight a few points about that, because it's really interesting how the PA has been developing many different strategies. Some like have this more institutional approach, so to say, such as, for example, ILP. This is like an initiative, popular initiative for a law, right? They presented it in the parliament. Of course, it was rejected. But the interesting thing, I think the people from the PA didn't expect the parliament to approve that. But it actually was like one institutional way to precisely to show that the representative institutions are just unable to accept those very proposals, right? And then they went to other strategies, as the occupations of buildings, as Dario mentioned, and also then the scratches, which they took from Argentina. You know, the word scratch means, well, this outing is the word in public outing, yeah. So it's like people concentrating, for example, in front of some politicians' houses, so, and then waiting and, well, shouting or protesting in a peaceful way, okay? But actually, well, it introduced, well, the whole question of housing in the whole country, right? So yeah, and in general, it's like it's really interesting how the PA works, like the people there. Well, it stresses self-organization and also going from the individual to the collective. So the people affected, of course, they first are affected in a very individual way, or the family, and they are, of course, isolated, depressed by this. They first go to an assembly by the PA, and then they get like this support. But what the people from the PA stress is that everything is about the self-empowerment of these people, so they all can receive like the tools to solve their own cases, but also in the collective way. So it's a very interesting combination of collective encounters and ways of organizing, but also then how every individual, every family can self-empower themselves. And maybe, yeah, if you want to continue, and then we can go to the second part.
Maybe to kind of start closing, not to start the discussion. Something, for instance, we were discussing on Saturday at the Free University with regarding, for instance, the water problems. No, trying to link Cochabamba and the water struggles, Detroit, what is going on there, what is going in Gaza. Connecting all that, there was also this discussion on a challenge of the movements in the present, where let's say in Latin America, for instance, the neo-populist states are kind of like taking over the language of the movements, no? And so, for instance, Oscar Olivera was talking about the necessity of creating more nets or networks linking the different struggles and connecting strategies so as to avoid this idea that the movements are just leading towards like the state, and then the state displaces the empowerment that the movements have created. No, so this is in a way to displace the way we look at movements and the redefining of politics from there.
Yeah, let's open this up. No. Let's open this up. I think for the video, it's ideal if we pass the microphone around. I know this isn't the most obvious architecture of collective discussion, but I think we're all bigger than the corporate university here. So yeah, let's just get some comments from the audience. Feel free to speak to each other, and then we'll hear again from the panelists. So if you raise your hand, Becky can bring you the microphone.
I guess I wanted to make a couple of points, or observations and a couple of points. One was, as you guys have discussed this, then the global movement of the squares, as it's been called, one thing that's not coming up is the question of the Arab Spring or the Middle East, and it's I just want to sort of mark that and wonder that as a pro-democracy movement, and what they seem to be fighting for, though, is this sort of liberal democracy, or that's how it's represented to us. So how does that complicate or adjunct your observations about the movement of the squares in Europe and Latin America and other places? It's the one sort of piece of that was sort of missing from the talk, so I was curious about that. And also this question of the professional organizer and the NGOs, a lot of the organizers from Occupy, a lot of those young folks who came to Zuccotti Park are now working for organizations, basically because they need to survive. A lot of them went to work for 350 or Avaz for the mobilization, for instance, and this is sort of a question of, so the question of sustainability, like you're calling for a kind of, it seems to be advocating for a kind of, deprofessionalized sort of grassroots activism, but then that seems to be, this seems to always have a sort of limit beyond which it can't. So we sort of, what is the possibility for long-term grassroots struggles without an economy that supports any kind of alternative lifestyle, where as it were, particularly in New York, where it's always been a struggle organizing in New York with that. That's always been this real limit. So that's about it. That's all I got.
Thanks. Yeah, we've got a hand up here. Or maybe Becky, you can start right behind you, and then we'll go up to the third row there.
I'm from Brazil, and in Brazil, sorry, because I'm here to improve my English, and sometimes maybe I can speak completely well, but I will try. We are trying to understand now what happened with the movements that occupy the streets last year, because next year the situation changed completely with the World Cup, and even in the election campaign the situation is completely different. I would like to hear you about it.
Thank you.
About suffering, and as a Brooklynite, I work in the Park Slope Food Co-op, trying to prevent the acceptance of free trade agreements. But arms and fighting and suffering, and then fossil fuel and weather and suffering. And how are those dialogues, how do they enter into the awareness of people who are like you, who are thinking about direct democracy?
Does anybody else want to jump in on this first round? Yep.
These questions or answers, the one before her, were they asking questions, or that's what they kind of, she said, why did these movements end? Was that a question, or was that?
I think it was a question. You know, this is an open space. I think comments, questions, or answers are all welcome.
Because, you know, a lot of the times, the movements that come, I'm fine. The movements that come at a time with certain people, even though they say there's no organizer, they say there's no leader. You know, there is somebody who is more likely to get them to rally the people to do certain things, so the movement will go forward. You know, you have everything from the marches for the civil rights movement that are much different today than they were before. They involve other people. They actually involve more women. They involve more family solutions. Now they involve men who don't want to give up the platform. You have the gardening. You know, that when the movement started, it was to clean up spaces that were occupied by heroin addicts, pimps, prostitutes, decomposing bodies in your neighborhood. And people said no. Now the gardens are occupied by yuppies who cook steaks after work. They don't want other people in the garden. They think the garden is attached to their apartments, and it came like that. It's like some type of, you know, barbecue garden, beer drinking area. You see, they evicted the people that started. So movements change because people change, and they do other things. Williamsburg, I remember when we took Williamsburg, like any other SWAT type situation, and then when we went to grow stuff, this was like in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was like president or whatever, we realized that the soil was contaminated. So we like, you can't grow vegetables. And then other people came and turned into this whole art movement, which I understand So that's basically what happens, particularly when they're college movements. When you're in college and it's building and you're there and whatever, and it's that girl that's doing it, so you want to be near her or whatever, whether you're a girl or another guy or whatever, it doesn't matter. And then you graduate or you get thrown out and daddy stops paying for it, you realize the whole thing's a sham, you leave. NYU is different each year depending on who's running what program. You know, so that's the reality.
Great, thank you. Wow, so I think you guys have a decent menu of options for your minds to feast on. We have the Arab Spring, what its true goals are, the degeneration of leaderless organizers into professional organizers, or maybe the movements were never leaderless in the first place. The question of arms, fossil fuels, their relationship to suffering, what's happened in Brazil with its annual gigantic transformations, and then the question of green gentrification in New York and of course in cities around the world. So I think I'll just leave it to you to, lend some structure or refuse to lend some structure to these topics.
This is also why we wanted to limit our presentation so that we can have as open a conversation as possible, because so many people are coming from such different backgrounds. And at least in New York, when Occupy has morphed, or I believe Occupy is kind of not at the scale of Spain and the level of organization as in Spain, but I think we are borrowing from the Spaniards who talk about the DNA of the 15M. I think we have that from Occupy. But there is also that sense, especially in New York, that it kind of like something kind of stops, so wanting to have more of a conversation. So I should have said in the beginning around the Arab Spring, Mark, that, and can I say that Mark is the initiator of the Illuminator? So there's a little bit of props to, in a non-hierarchical sense, but those of us who create really important things for the movement should, I believe we should recognize that, and that's part of having, being a more horizontal movement is also acknowledging different things that people do. The Illuminator is the one that projects with light slogans and things, political slogans, right? On walls, on institutions, things like that. Anyway, so usually we start saying that we're actually, while we mark everything from the end of 2010, so with the Arab Spring, there are significant differences, and it's a whole other conversation. But then we don't see it as this, at least in our book. I'm not speaking for, I wouldn't presume to speak. But we're speaking to the similar movements kind of since the, and not every single one, but most, because of exactly what you're saying, that there's a different question as far as the state and where the state is. So yeah, even though there are a lot of similarities, there were integrated workplaces in Tunisia, there are assemblies in Tunisia, there are all kinds of things that we see that are very similar, but they actually don't fit into the same thing. The NGOs, I think, is a really good question, and how we survive and how we, going from being organizers and we all want to change the world, and then how do we do that? So do we have a day job and then we change the world after? Do we, and I think, as much as possible, ideally one would incorporate our politics into the spheres we're already in. So rather than professionalizing the activism, it's bring it back to your university if that's where you're housed, or bring it to your workplace, or create something together, which people are doing more in Latin America. We've been seeing that, and again, kind of Latin America is about 20 years ahead of these movements in Europe and the US. So people have been, for example, in the north of Argentina, around Corrientes, up and down the Andes, where people have been defending the earth and using forms of the direct action, physically blockading Monsanto in Malvinas, not the island Malvinas, but the north of Argentina. I could go on and on. La Famatina is a mountain that people have prevented. Actually, now 3 companies are already from exploiting it for gold. So communities as a whole are organizing, societies and movements. But then there's this question. So this is kind of scaling it up from an Occupy question, but I think it's where we could potentially be going. So, okay, we're going to stop these corporations from taking our land, but it also then means these were the sources of work for people in the community. So what do? And in Argentina, there's a whole network now of assemblies that have been doing this direct action that are now saying, well, okay, so how do we survive? And so they've started to come up with, on a very small scale. So there's now a group that's self-organizing tourism, because it's an area for tourism. So rather than working for the mining company, having tourism self-organized by people in the movements and starting to think more about how to survive in a collective way. So ideally, that's how we go. New York, there's a disproportionate number of people who, partly I think because of the climate march, but having traveled to some other cities, maybe that's different. I think San Francisco might have similarities to New York, but there are all kinds of reasons that I think a lot of big organizations came into New York and said, okay, let's grab the organizers.
Yeah, I heard everybody.
And I don't think feeling guilty is useful. I mean, I don't think it's ideal, but also fine. Building a union is fine, even if the movements aren't organizing using the traditional forms of unions. Unions, that's great. So I think we need to be more accepting and understanding of each other and the different situations we're in. And people who organized for the climate march and got paid to do it, and I know there were a lot of discussions and tensions within the movement around that. And, you know, as long as we're continuing to push a more radical and democratic agenda, I think it's all fine. I mean, I think we worry about too many of these things sometimes. Doesn't mean I won't engage the discussion in a serious way, but I think we sometimes take ourselves too seriously, and there's so many other things we need to be thinking about. Now, I have comments on other parts, but I'm going to stop there because I know it.
Along that, I think maybe one of the questions that we face, no, like you were saying, yeah, it was about kind of decentering the figure of the professional organizer or the leaderless movement, although there are always figures, no, of like leaders and then a return of profession. But then that's why at the beginning, I don't know, something in the book I think it's emphasizes the idea of process, no, that it's a different also way of conceptualizing change, because of course you decenter one figure and then it comes back. My question there could be, yeah, but it comes back in the same way, no? It's like within like professional organizing, things have changed a little bit sometimes within the language of organizing, and that can be seen as a change in a way, no? Because there is now an awareness that politics cannot be reduced and limited to that, just being, you know, led by an organizer. There is more participation. And I think that is an interesting slight change, no? But the problem I think in these struggles is that that there is no end point, no? They say, oh, everything is solved. But then it's more difficult to think about it, because you say, and then it's worth doing things if everything, no, will be coming back. Also, like in the case of Bolivia, I was bringing it because there is also a sense of defeat in a way from the water struggles. Like now there is a government that the movements made possible, but then the language is different from the language of the movement, the laws that they are passing regarding natural resources, but then there is now a feeling that, okay, movements need to speak a different language so as to continue, no? So I think this is also a different.
Talking about the organizers, I mean, I would say looking at the US, a big difference is that 20 years ago they would all have been absorbed by the Democratic Party somehow, by the Rainbow Coalition or whatever, and it didn't happen this time. So it's, I think, already some kind of progress that it didn't happen, and that even in I mean, yesterday the climate march, I know there were a lot of critiques, etc., but if one saw the people, they were not demonstrating for corporate interests. They had a very clear stand against corporate interests, and the slogans were not the ones that were proposed by NGOs, but you could hear the slogans from Occupy repeating again, or slogans leaning on Occupy slogans, etc. So I think it's important to acknowledge that these movements have, and that's happened all over. They in some parts they have been, yes, destroyed by war, like it also happened about 100 years ago. But like in many of the countries of the Arab Spring, etc. But if we look all over, they could not be absorbed like it was before. Like all the movements we've seen during the past decades were at some moment reintegrated into the representative democracy game, and this time it didn't happen. They were brought back to certain practices, and this time it's like, if we look at the Mareas, it's the unions and these mobilizations that took over the forms of the movement, and not and it's not that all the movements turned into a union, and that happened, I think, in many places. We saw it even in the US. I mean, a lot of unions changed, and if we see like the nurses that now are constantly saying we're part of the 99% and take the slogans and etc. I think that's something we have to acknowledge, even if it's not. And that's also the thing about process. It doesn't always happen like, it's not a music box. It's not don't put a coin in it and the song you chose is going to play. It's a social process, and that means that there are a lot of components part of it. I think another very interesting question is the one about the ecology and sustainable surrounding development, etc., and the question of direct democracy. And if I look at all these factories, for example, that workers took over in the different countries in Europe, it's very interesting that one common thing about all of them is that they all moved to some kind of eco-friendly, sustainable, regional, local production. Like one in France near Marseille was a Unilever Lipton tea factory. The workers occupied it during 3 years, managed that they couldn't take the machines out. 2 months ago, they won the struggle. The Unilever had to leave them all the machines and the factory building and pay the workers that occupied each worker $150,000 that they're going to put into, and they put into restarting the factory. They don't produce anymore any industrial tea like they used to do with Lipton. They produce now organic linen tea and organic fruit tea from local products. There is another factory about 100 kilometers from Marseille, that Pilpa, now Fabrique du Sou. They used to produce ice cream for a big chain of grocery stores. So a big ice cream producer bought them just to have the access to the grocery stores and closed down the factory. The workers occupied it. After 2 years of struggle, they could keep half of the machines and the factory. They're now producing organic yogurt and organic ice cream distributed locally and regionally. The factory in Greece used to be do chemical construction material, industrial glue and things like that. They're now producing organic cleaners, organic soap, etc., etc. Distributed through local and regional networks, social centers, solidarity initiatives, etc. In Italy, both factories have the problem that they cannot continue the production they had before. One was producing pipes for air conditioning for cars for BMW. The owner took out all the machines, but they were reinventing themselves and started doing recycling of household goods and like refrigerators, washing machines, etc., and recycling of computers, and then they have connections with organic farmers and buy their products to produce, like they buy tomatoes and produce sauce and sell it. They buy, so they buy different things and produce something out of it that they then distribute. And they have a business plan to go into industrial recycling.
See, that's the question. Are they making more money this way? I mean, there's money.
No, they're not making a lot. They're not making any money at all. They're now earning $500 a month, each worker, and they're working a lot. And they're doing it because they believe that their kind of change and the solidarity they had and they have and the networks they build, so that makes sense to change something. They don't expect anything. They don't want to go into the regular market. They want to build different structures because that's their experience, that the only ones that had any were of any help for them and supported their struggle were all these alternative networks and not the market. So they don't want to go into the market again, so they want to build something different. The main idea of all these countries, and especially like if you look to these countries like in Spain or in Greece or Italy, where they've been so really like damaged by the austerity programs and by the monetary fund or the European Central Bank, the main idea is they say we have to build something where we just rely on our forces and where we rely on our networks, because then, even if there is a supposed crisis or anything, we don't need anyone to invest money here. We don't need the International Monetary Fund to come and give something, because we can survive on our own. And that's the only alternative, because if you don't have that, then you're depending, obviously, on the big money by banks, etc., etc. So, and it's workers, and it's not university students, and these, I think, they're very genuine movements that come from below and are very clear about these questions.
Just to add a little bit to what Susanna was saying, and also someone, I think it was you, mentioned elections. I'm sorry, I don't know very much about the specific situation in Brazil. Maybe you can help us to know a bit more. But yeah, I think maybe one way to put it is that, well, movements never win, so to say, but also they never lose either. So it's like, it's basically that they function in a different frequency, which is very difficult to represent precisely and to I don't know, to capture, to understand even sometimes. But for example, I guess that many of these movements, regardless their specific, I don't know, outcomes or successes or failures, whatever word you want to use, they've been like beginning to create, I think, certain cultural elements, if you like, that I think that politics later, I think, have to deal with that in certain ways. I don't know. I have to return to the Spanish example, maybe because it's the best, the one I know the best. But for example, from January onwards, there has been like different initiatives, more in an electoral plane in Spain. One is Podemos, is We Can, and the other one is Ganemos, is We Win. Very different in many forms. Like Podemos is like basically a group of leaders, of promoters with high media visibility, but then also combined with the creation of circles in local assemblies throughout the country. The other one, Ganemos, is, I think, more horizontal in its inception, very related in its beginnings to the PA, actually. But what I would like to highlight is that both initiatives are really participative, and even now, like, the major parties are trying to imitate, so to say, the assemblyary methods, of course with pathetic results, but it's very symptomatic that they are realizing that they need to include some of these things. The important thing in any case is that any political initiative has also to, I don't know, to adopt the code, the DNA, if you like, of the movement, and I think that's in itself it's a great achievement. Then of course probably like many disappointments will come, or many problems, many other discussions, but at least it produced, like for example, at least in Spain, it has produced the elements for a new political culture that is really like a big breaking with I don't know, like 35, even almost 40 years of liberal democracy, right? So there is a very strong element in that. For other countries, I think it's maybe one way to put it, I don't know, maybe the case in Brazil, of course, like according to its country history and with the elements and etc. But it's like maybe, well, not now, but maybe in a time, there are like, well, different like seeds that are beginning to grow up, and then maybe they are not visible right now, but they could like take different forms. I don't know. I see in general the movements. I think that, yeah, that they begin to change sometimes the landscape and create the conditions of possibility for future developments that may take form or may not. Of course, that's the struggle, right? But and sometimes it may take very disappointing forms also. But I guess that's how history goes. Right? I don't know.
I think suffering is something we haven't. Know that you were talking about suffering, and I was thinking, for instance, about the rental strike at Sunset Park, no, and because it involved a lot of suffering before and during the rent strike, and mostly women, no, were like going for the strike, going through lots of pain, harassment of sorts, and violence. But at the same time, I remember talking to them, and the idea of being together was a way of dealing with the suffering in a form that is very different from just being isolated, no? And having to just be evicted and going alone to look for something else. So in the process, what I found really interesting is that the suffering is not that it vanished, because there is suffering in the present itself of the struggle, but it's a different form of going through. Yeah.
I think that being a militant in the center of the empire has a particular anguish attached to it. That working through the Park Slope Food Co-op, which is like trying to distinguish itself from liberal democracy, but feeling also the shipment of armaments that is paid for by the United States, manufactured in the United States, and now all over the Middle East, where people are just using them to kill each other, and the fossil fuel industry's home with the multinationals that live in the United States or go now to escape from taxes. I think we have a particular anguish, and I don't know sometimes how to connect it with the models that you are presenting from, which are wonderful hopes of people in more self-contained and less guilty in some ways cultures than we are here in the United States. Well, it's strange.
Yeah, I see something missing in some of this. Yeah, I see something missing a little bit in some of this. This is what's been bothering me. On the one hand, you've got co-ops, you have Occupy, you have factories that are sort of taken over and relaunched in more cooperative ways. The problem with a lot of this is I don't see it as being self-sustaining in a lot of places. For example, in the early 20th century in industrialized Europe, you had a working class culture that didn't just include these things. It included childcare, it included care for the elderly and the disabled, it included instruction or education, it included, there was a kind of a cradle to grave culture you could participate in as a working class revolutionary even. I see bits and pieces of that, but I don't see it all coming together. And that's why I think you have this phenomenon that you have people who, they're out of college, they don't have a whole lot of material needs, they can participate in a movement for a particular length of time before they go off and start their proper careers, and so often you have this cycle. And I think that we have many opportunities to develop something more because the system we have now continually puts us up against the wall. And so you have the anti-globalization movement, you have Occupy, et cetera, et cetera. Those are opportunities, but I don't see this sort of holistic thing coming together, which doesn't have to be around an ideology. It doesn't have to be around unions, which it was before, but I think it's worth noting, for example, in the 80s in Britain, Thatcher's rhetoric was very specific about wanting to destroy that working class culture, that the state and the capitalist system understands that when there's something holistic there, that's when they're really threatened, and they understand this. And if we don't attempt, what I want to see is the ways we can take all of these different elements and put them together such that we have something that people can commit to for long periods of time, hopefully for their whole lives. Until we do that, then we're simply trying, I mean, not simply, but we're, on a certain level, we're trying to recreate the vehicle over and over again with different people, et cetera, different players. And I'd like, what I'm looking for is some way to see past this particular part of the problem.
It's true because the food co-op, when I was a teenager, I'm from Park Slope, and when I was a teenager, we started the food co-op, and it was great, you know, and then those people left, other people came, they got more blah, 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 and, you know, it's, no one wants to be a part. I want nothing to do with Park Slope Food Co-op, and I remember when it started. PS1 was on 9th Street. When we started that had a daycare center. They closed that and made that the bar. You can go there and get drunk, spend some money, restaurant, you know. So the things that you're saying, we all incorporated these things, and I've watched these things since I ran for my life from high school in 1975 when I was a freshman at 12 years old. So I've watched all of these movements, and what's interesting, every last one of these movements that you mentioned, all was started by the same people. With at least one of the same people, from the food co-op to PS1 to Occupy, who started it. And I can tell you, they are part of the 1%. They're not me. They're my rich friend from Park Slope.
Does someone else want to chime in before we get back to the panel here?
Ouch.
Yes, I'll turn it to you.
May I ask a question? Well, thank you for your lovely presentations. I thought they're actually very complimentary. And I wanted to, I suppose, ask the opposite of the question that he just asked, which is, instead of asking the question, how does this become one thing, my question is, aren't these things very many separate things? And I wanted to ask you to speak about the plurality and the tension within these movements. My experience with colleagues in Spain was that the 15M was many different things at the same time, and some people resisted that being spoken to as one thing. And then the critique of representation was constant, but the break with it was very tense. So some people wanted to go to electoral politics, and this happened in Occupy. Some segments wanted to join up with the Democratic Party, some people didn't. Green Party. In Brazil, I mean, many people in Brazil don't think that was one movement. That was lots and lots of things. So I wanted to ask you, and I know this was implicit in both the presentations, but I wanted you to speak to that, about the plurality and the tensions, the conceptions of what direct democracy means within these movements, and how, and what do we do with that?
Okay, so these are some great, do you mind if I,
Go for it.
I'm sorry. It's also the kind of baby question that I can then jump to the baby next. So there are a number of things I want to address, and I'll take up too much time too, so we can have another round of kind of discussion, conversation. Just a brief, and I don't usually say, well, I'm going to recommend a book for the question of frustration and despair and the Park Slope Co-op. Rebecca Solnit has a short book called Hope in the Dark, and it is one of my favorite books, and it's this small book. And
her last name?
Solnit. She's actually in town for the climate march, as is David Solnit, who's been helping to make art and kind of a nice sister-brother team. But this one book, it talks about how we don't always know the effect of what we do when we do it, which isn't to say we don't need to keep organizing. And I'm going to get to some of the other comments a little bit, but sometimes we don't recognize enough what we're actually doing. And so there are really concrete examples in this book of, for example, the anti-nuclear movement in the United States, particularly looking at Nevada, and how that inspired a poet in Uzbekistan who read an anti-nuclear poet on national television that sparked the movement there, and they kind of trace it back, which actually was successful, and they trace it back to the organizing done in Nevada. So there's all of these kind of concrete examples, but speaking to, not despairing, but hoping. And there is that pressure. I mean, I think our movements, though, having traveled around the world quite a bit and basing myself now in kind of Europe, Latin America, when people talk about Occupy, they are so excited that the US had Occupy. And that people continue to organize. So looking to the places where we are organizing and saying, okay, we haven't been successful yet, or winning, as Vicente is talking about, is this really complicated concept, but looking to those places where we are organizing and deepening it. Going to Eric, who we go back to the Direct Action Network in New York, there is definitely continuity with some people in some of the groups. It was not that Occupy came from nowhere and the 15M came from nowhere, and there's lots of individuals and groupings that it kind of follows a continuity from the past. But the question of self-sustainability, I think, is both really important and something that's beginning to happen a little bit. And I'll give an example from Greece that I think is the most inspiring. And since we've been traveling for just the last few weeks so far, but this book tour we're doing is going to go until later October throughout different parts of the US. And New York, we're only doing a few events in New York, so we were in North Carolina and parts of New Jersey, places where, book tours don't always go. But meeting with people, because Occupy was in more than 1,000 cities and towns and villages in the US, so meeting with people in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and in Charlotte, and in Durham, and in Greensboro. And interestingly, what people wanted to talk about was organization. So there were questions and frustrations and, kind of what did Occupy actually accomplish? But then each person who had been involved, people are involved in different things. And we're talking about a desire for a level of organization that I think is really exciting. It's not there, but it's exciting that that's where the conversation is. And I know from those of us from the Direct Action Network, when we were fighting against the World Bank and the IMF, our conversation was not at the level of, well, how do we connect our cities and the projects we're doing and thinking in terms of really restructuring things generally. And then one concrete example is in Thessaloniki in Greece, where we were just a few months ago, and that's where this recuperated workplace is, Viomet. And linked to Viomet, there are a few things that are going on. It's the workplace that now produces organic cleaning agents. But the way they're relating to the community is not just the community supports us, which is, of course, the way it's been in Latin America and is very important. None of these workplaces could be taken over and run by workers without the community support. But now it's a support group, basically, you can join. And you're a sustainer, and you pay a little bit each month, and you get cleaning products for it. But then when the assemblies happen of the workplace, there are certain assemblies where you get to participate, not to have veto power or absolute decision-making, but the community plays a role in the conversations of what's produced. And I think that is one really exciting beginning of a connection. Another one that they're doing is, I'm sure people have heard about the direct consumer producer networks that have been emerging out of crisis, particularly in Greece or in Spain. So people who produce potatoes, bring them to the city and sell them directly to people in urban areas, so you don't have to go through the stores and pay that extra cost, and it's direct. And that's great. It's now, in this one space in Thessaloniki again, it's being coordinated where there are now hundreds of producers and many, many more consumers who've discussed together a plan for the next year. So that people talk about, okay, well, how many potatoes do you think you'll consume in the next year? How many tomatoes? How much olive oil? And the growing, is decided based on what people need. And then they can put seed money into it. So it's really interesting assemblies trying to figure out what that can look like. And I think between workplaces and then agricultural production and consumption, there are beginnings of this visioning what a kind of self-sustaining space could look like. Latin America has a lot of other examples. I'm just going to touch on, I'm not going to talk about plurality and multiplicity, maybe you guys can. And I'm going to do a pitch now for the NACLA journal that's here, which is on horizontalism and autonomy in Argentina. Horizontalism and autonomy in Latin America. And there are contributors, including Rosa Becci, talking about the environmental organizing that I referenced earlier, in South America as a whole, not just in Argentina. Gustavo Esteva wrote about Mexico, and that's actually kind of this idea of seeds and the movements, and how you don't always know in the moment the effect of the movement, or that you see it, but it doesn't look exactly the same. He talks about that in Mexico, and then in Argentina, the way people reference that, as people talk about being hijos of the 19-20, the 19th and 20th, that moment of break in Argentina, and there was popular rebellions and forms of horizontal organizing, and that was in 2001. And the way people talk about organizing now is that they're children of the 19th and 20th, kind of that moment, and you see that in their forms of organizing. I won't talk anymore about the NACLA piece, but the journal is there if people want to get it. And it really does help, and if you don't know about the experiences in Latin America, I think you'll actually be quite surprised to read about organizing that's been going on for the last 10 and 20 years, that looks so much like Greece, Spain, Brazil. I'm sorry, we haven't even talked about Brazil yet, but I'm going to pass it on for time's sake.
Maybe to address some of the questions, of the comments about this unity of, like, for example, what used to be the working class culture and the plurality right now. I don't know, just maybe a very general comment, but of course it's like movements, societies in movement, or some people are questioning like this notion of social movements, right? It's just too schematic. Basically, maybe if we can think of movements like, well, it's movement is like is a product of the society itself, which created it, right? So it has to be, in its society, has like very different features, elements, histories, etc. So probably, well, of course, the movements going on right now cannot be anything else than a reflect of what is its country right now. So, for example, working class culture was possible, of course, in a social world that was existing then, like the social world of also, which was a product of Fordism and, well, many other factors that, of course, with all these terrible elements, but also at the same time it gave the possibility of, well, like the world of the factory, more people working together, so also protesting together, etc. These kind of things. So maybe one, for example, in the case of Occupy, we cannot forget, I mean, and you all know this much better than me, that of course, like after, well, Reagan, for example, how this country was completely changed by the Reagan era, and also, well, all these effects of neoliberalism in very basic social relationships, I think. So, and I think this is something that we think a lot. It's also, and this connects with the organizers' question, maybe. Of course, it's not that, it's not about like rejecting the role of professional organizers. Probably they're like much needed in a country that where many social relationships have been destroyed. I don't know, in other countries which may be more, I don't know, dense social worlds or social relationship, it's possible to have like masses in the street, I don't know. And here, of course, as the lady said earlier, it's really hard to be a militant in the heart of the empire, right? So I don't know. So maybe one way to put it is like, well, if the working class movement were like a reflection of that social world, that economic world, I don't know, maybe what we are experiencing right now is like also how the movements of post-Fordism look like, also in its potential and in its limitations, of course, like more fragmentation, more dispersion sometimes. But at the same time, of course, like a great deal of creativity. It's true what you said, it's like May 15th or even Occupy here are like many things at the same time, many different things, but because it has to do more with a code that you take and then you apply somewhere else and so on. But yeah, of course, at the same time, it has like also limitations, like, I don't know, the social media, for example, are really powerful, but at the same time, I don't know, like they give space for, I don't know, like selfie politics sometimes in a way. I don't know, it's like, it's very complicated.
Very short, because I don't know how much time we have, but I'm thinking like of the strategies, no? Because I mean, in the world of the factory, the organization of workers, even the party form, I mean, it's a way of organizing that kind of provided many solutions. I don't know if that's better or worse, because I think the problem is this struggle of capital, no? Against capital, within capital. And then I'm thinking, for instance, the piqueteros in Argentina, because you can, when you have unemployment as a problem, how can you organize around a factory? So the problem of thinking of creating other tools, other strategies, no? The piqueteros said, we cannot go on strike because we don't have a job, so we don't have the factory, but we can stop the circulation of capital, so we can block the roads, no? So, I mean, and I think it's an exercise of thinking about that, no? How can we do that? Like on Saturday, a workshop on like water struggles, and that a woman coming from Maine saying, our water is about to be just totally privatized, we will not have any right to the water in the lakes we have, and we are organizing there, but someone from Bolivia who went through the same experience said, well, we can talk, no, we can share strategies, how do we do this? But then we were talking, how do we make that visible, for instance, in New York, this is going on in Maine, and maybe we don't have any idea that's going on, and we are buying water, the water that is making these people have like no access to the water they have. So I think it's this net of like strategies, sharing and thinking, okay, how we can act if we don't have that factory, no, as a model, and maybe that, like visualizing and doing more things. But for that, there is a need for learning of what's going on, and I think that's a whole issue, no? Because we are isolated, we are like working non-stop, or I mean, it's very difficult to even stop and talk and have a conversation about what's going on. There's never time for that.
Thanks. Great. So I think at this point we've talked about multiple places, multiple theories of power, multiple struggles, multiple currents within those struggles with various points of view. So outside are there refreshments? There are refreshments. There's also lots of texts to look at, and then I think there are books and magazines. Camilo's back. Camilo also has many theories of power, or is inspiring new theories of power. So I think I would just say quickly, I want to give a big thank you to the speakers.